day, glimmering in the morning light. All my troubles seem so far away. Everything just feels so right, so right. Oh, what a day. Oh, what a day. A whole lot of sunshine is coming my way. What a day.
Of the popularity and the belief in conspiracy theories. And it's not just the belief in these things that troubles me. Conspiracy theories have always been with us. I mean, there are people who now, and even always have been, who believe that the earth is flat. Okay. In the 1950s and 60s, they believed that fluoridation of the water was a communist plot, undermine our health. And later they believed that Lee Harvey Oswald did not act alone. It was an inside job, JFK's assassination. And later, many believe the moonshot was faked. And not long after 9/11, those conspiracy theorists emerged to contend that this too was an inside job. And of course, there quickly emerged a Jewish version that said that Jews were behind 9/11 because it was falsely and preposterously alleged none of the 6,000 Jews who worked in the World Trade Center showed up on 9/11. Of course, that was nonsense. The Jews were prominently included among the victims of that attack. But those who embrace conspiracy theories are immune from facts and evidence. And even the horrid Sandy Hook tragedy in 2012, where 20 young students and 7 staff were murdered in an elementary school by a 20-year-old with an assault rifle who had earlier that morning shot his own mother. And that was quickly seized on by the conspiracy theorists. They claimed that the victims, that is the 6 and 7-year-olds that were murdered in their elementary school, were actually crisis actors. And the whole thing was staged by the government in an effort to impede stricter gun control laws. And the poor grieving parents of these murdered children were immediately subjected to ferocious threats by phone, internet, mail, and many of which continued even to this very day. Indeed, there was a mind-boggling report this week that one of the Sandy Hook parents was walking down the street in sophisticated Seattle, 3,000 miles from Connecticut, where Sandy Hook is, Sandy Hook Elementary, and 10 years after this tragedy, and he was recognized by one of the crazed believers in this conspiracy who ran up to him on the street and started screaming, "Shame, shame." So this incident is a potent and disturbing illustration of the strength.
No, it just boggles my mind how somebody can interpret reality to sit and do that. I mean, to sit and have spent that much time to have embedded in his own brain the vision of somebody 3 miles away, and to sit and go, "Oh yeah, now I'm going to take this guy to destroy his day today." Why? I mean, it's maddening. It's insane.
It is insane. And this is 5 years after Alex Jones, who's the owner of that website InfoWars, who was the force behind creating that conspiracy. He acknowledged in 2019, he acknowledged publicly that the massacre was real and that his broadcasts were what was fake. And then 4 years ago, the next year, he was successfully sued in 2020 for over $1 billion by the Sandy Hook parents. And that trial and the revelations that came out of it were broadcast all over the world, every media and news source. And yet, as you point out, Randy, and yet the believers in Sandy Hook still believe, and so these conspiracy theories we've talked about, they're just a mention. There's just a sample of them. There's a whole bunch of others. I mean, there's the black helicopters, the Obama was born in Kenya, the deep state ones, and many more. And they've always made me a bit uncomfortable, and they probably did for you too, all these conspiracy theories. But and most people are uncomfortable by it. But the reason they never troubled me that much in the past was because it seemed to me that only a very limited number of people actually believe this nonsense. And so these crackpot notions do not appear to be persuading all but a tiny fringe, and thus were of no real consequence to me or you or a threat to our nation. Not anymore.
That's true.
Not anymore. What's terrifying to me now, and it should be terrifying to everybody, is not only the sudden sharp rise in the number of conspiracy theories, But more terrifying still is the number of ordinary and even educated Americans who believe deeply and unshakably in the most dangerous and preposterous of these conspiracy theories. And what's even worse still is that, like the number of victims of scams, the number of people who say they believe in these conspiracies is growing rapidly. There's a new poll that shows that 17% of all Americans, that's tens of millions of people in America, now believe that the condensation trails that jets leave in the sky, okay, are actually chemtrails, which are these poisonous emissions that the government is deliberately emitting in the sky to control us. Over a third of the American electorate believe that the 2020 election was, quote, stolen. And this includes the majority of a major political party. Indeed, a professed belief in this conspiracy theory is now a prerequisite in many places for a member of that party who wishes to run for office. 15% of Americans believe that climate change is fake. And reliable data shows that over a third of all Americans believe that the COVID vaccine is more dangerous than COVID.
That's the one, I'm sure you're going to get into it. That's the one that is just stunning to me. And people would rather take the risk and die than sit and have a vaccine. And we'll get to that in a minute, but think of the star athletes that decided not to get vaccinated. And it's just crazy. I mean, they spoon-fed crazy into the media on their own. And I'm sorry, that one, along with the other ones that you just listed, it trips my trigger because you sit there. I had a conversation today with a guy about chemtrails. I knew probably we'd be talking about it. And I said, "Do you think that plane up there is loading chemicals into the sky because they were sort of from that bent?" He goes, "Yeah, it happens every day." And I said, I did not know that. I mean, seriously. I mean, it's amazing fundamentally to me to find somebody that in their heart believe this stuff. I'm sorry. You tripped my trigger. Now that's a conspiracy. I don't have a trigger. So
well, I think that that's a good trigger to have triggered. I mean,
yeah.
There were 500,000 people in America. A million were killed by COVID.
Right.
And 500,000 of them said, "I'm not getting the vaccination." And now there's some people that say that was before the vaccine was available. Really, it's more closer to 300,000 who actually said, "I'm not getting it," after it was available. But still, a minimum of 300,000 people who said, here was this miracle vaccination. RNA technology whipped it up in a hurry. And vaccines have been around since George Washington vaccinated his troops,
Right.
and it works. And 300,000 people said, "I don't want it." There were media personalities, guys who have radio shows and stuff that were against it. 300,000 of them died of COVID.
Yeah.
I mean, so I see that the COVID conspiracies people have the blood of 300,000 people on their hands because they believe this nonsense. So scientists say that another bigger pandemic is inevitable at some point. And if large numbers of Americans refuse vaccine, it's going to kill much more than the million who died of COVID. So what the heck is going on here again? We long led the world in advance. Just two universities in my backyard here, Stanford and University of California, Berkeley, alone responsible for one out of every 8 Nobel Prizes in every field since 1900. Okay.
Wow.
So why are these crazy things happening here in the United States? We earlier talked about the failure of schools to teach critical thinking. But what is the mechanism? Okay, that's what we're going to talk about in this podcast now. The mechanism of the failure of thinking that's behind this now. Okay, I've been pondering this question, Randy, for a long time. Last fall, I visited the major cities and some major cities in Eastern Europe, and all of these cities have these incredible memorials to the Jews that were killed in the Holocaust, and especially in Berlin. But the most powerful and moving of all these memorials to me was the one along the Danube River in Budapest, Hungary. There are these little bronze replicas of thousands and thousands of shoes, big and small. They're scattered along the riverbank of the Danube there. And that memorial commemorates the atrocity in January 1945 when the local Nazis, the locals now, rounded up tens of thousands of Jews, local Jews, men, women, and children, took them down to the riverbank, made them take off their shoes so they could resell the shoes, and then shot them all and threw their bodies in the river. And what was most striking to me about this, and still sticks in my head, is that both the perpetrators of this unthinkable horror and the victims were local people. The perpetrators were not invading foreigners, okay? And they were not and doing this to avenge what the Jews allegedly had done to them in some earlier, they weren't citizens of a foreign country, nor were there either side participants in a civil war. So the usual historical, logical, if you could call them that, historical reasons for mass atrocities, none of them were present here. Both the perpetrators and the victims in this case were just local people in this sophisticated city of Budapest, long a wealthy and worldly European capital, where tens of thousands of ordinary citizens were persuaded by ludicrous, baseless, evidenceless claims about their neighbors, not strangers or foreigners, but people who've been living in the same neighborhood with them for 6 centuries. They were persuaded that and the Jews are not aliens or strangers. They shopped in the same place that he did business. They waved each other on the street for hundreds of years. And yet these ordinary citizens, these ordinary Nazis, were persuaded, without a shred of evidence whatsoever, to go into their neighbors' homes, drag them all out, children screaming and crying, take them all down to the river and shoot them all and throw their bodies into the Danube.
Now, for a little perspective, this is January 1945, and what day did the European theater end?
It
Months
ended.
later?
It ended in August of 45. So this was
45.
A matter of months before the war ended.
So they had to make a decision on their own at the end of a war that probably was, they knew that they were going to lose. And this mindset was, they're going to go do this. And it's madness. It's absolute freaking madness.
It is
Happened in a
madness.
community.
I sat down there by this poignant site and watched the sunset over Budapest. And as that pink glow of the sunset played on the walls and the towers of Budapest there on both sides of this beautiful, elegant Danube River, I stared out at this, uncomprehending as you are, these thousands of these bronze shoes along the riverbank, a part of this powerful and very disturbing memorial. Well, at least I thought to myself, at least this sort of thing cannot happen here in the U.S. Because of our culture and background. We're inoculated from believing these kinds of crazy things. And then almost immediately.
Excuse me, you and I know where we're going with this, and I'm telling you, it's already shriveled my patience right now. I can't wait to hear your next few words on this particular topic.
Immediately on my return in November of last year, 23, Elon Musk responded to a tweet on X, which was formerly Twitter, and the tweet said, Jewish communities have been pushing the exact kind of dialectical hatred against whites that they want people to stop using against them, unquote. That same evening, Elon Musk replied to that tweet, and he said, quote, you have said the actual truth, unquote. He went on in another reply to, quote, say, I am deeply offended by ADL, that's the Anti-Defamation League, messaging, and by other groups who push de facto anti-white racism or anti-Asian racism of any kind, unquote. So let's reflect on these comments for a moment. If Jews or the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, or any Jewish group had actually sent out such, quote, messaging, okay, as is claimed here, in an effort to, quote, influence the American public, they would obviously have to send out thousands, actually millions of such messages, and they would have had to send them to a wide cross-section of the public, which would have offended quite a number of them. And if they had done that, there'd be a massive paper trail of evidence of the ADLs or some other Jewish organization campaign in the form of those emails and letters and posters, ads, or whatever communication it was. But of course, no such emails, ads, or papers exist. And when challenged, Musk could not point to a single email or message, not a single one. Which of course is because they weren't sent. So why then without a shred of evidence, would someone of Elon Musk's stature publicly make such a preposterously false and profoundly inflammatory claim, defaming an entire ethnic group of millions, as well as a renowned national organization of impeccable ethics like the ADL, before millions of his own followers? And his response brought me immediately back to that painful memory of the memorial I'd seen on the Danube and the other memorials I'd seen here about the Holocaust, of how millions of people had been inspired to do ghastly, unthinkable things to their neighbors, to ultimately murder 8 million innocent people, all based on these preposterous allegations that made no sense, and in which there was not and never has been a shred of evidence ever offered in support of the truth of those allegations. What is going on here? What does Elon Musk tell us, his tweet tell us today? A whole lot, actually. And so hold on, listen, I'm now going to tie all this together in this podcast with a unifying explanation. Let's start with what conspiracy theories, every single last one of them, all have in common. Okay. The answer starts back in the 6th century BC in Greece. At that time,
Just to underline what you just said, because I don't want anybody to miss. Go back and just restate what conspiracies, what topic are we heading down this path now? What conspiracies really mean? How are they defined?
they're defined as people believing something without that's basically a factual assertion
Right.
that is not only untrue, there's not only no evidence in favor of it, but there's most cases overwhelming, undisputable evidence against it, and they still
Yeah.
believe.
It's just crazy.
So the answer to underlying understanding, I'm trying to give all of us an understanding of this because I've struggled with it. Okay, the answer starts back in the 6th century BC. Now, hey, stay with me here. Okay, at that time there were many competing claims pushed by many different people, advocates, all seeking to explain the world and its physical phenomena. There was superstition, there was mysticism, there were a host of different mythologies. There were people who believed in revelation and a whole bunch of different religions and religious authorities and kings and queens and other authorities, and they all competed with each other ferociously against each other, claiming that they alone had the answers, that their truth was the only truth. It was into this environment that came Thales, Thales. Thales, the Greek philosopher. And he was the first person to argue in the 6th century BC that explanations of the world should, instead of these various sources of authority, be based solely on reason, evidence, and logic, as this was the only path to the truth. Many great minds throughout history have believed, and I'm share of that belief, that this assertion, this observation by Thales was the single greatest and most consequential insight in all human history. Let me say it again, that evidence, reason, and logic are the only path to truth. That
So
isn't.
he said we have to deal in reality.
Well, that is reality, the single most consequential insight
Right.
in all human history, okay? And this foundation of truth became the foundation of a way of explaining the world and reality that we today call capital P philosophy with a capital P, and science, which is a subpart of philosophy that deals with the physical world. Now, the little p philosophy means just any organized way of thinking, and don't confuse it with the capital P philosophy. It's a specific doctrine. This new doctrine, the capital P philosophy, urging reason and evidence, especially just how you seek the truth through science, created the modern world as we know it. These observations and arguments were picked up and refined and elaborated on by Socrates and by his student Plato, and then to some degree by Aristotle, and then by many others down through the ages who contributed and refined the doctrine of capital P philosophy. After a long hiatus in the Dark Ages, this way of thinking and seeking the truth again burst into prominence in Europe during the Renaissance. There, it ran headlong into the Catholic Church and its teachings. The Catholic Church held that Scripture, that is the writing of the Bibles, are infallible, and it was heresy to dispute anything in Scripture. the Catholic Church set up a ferocious and infamous tribunal called the Inquisition to seek out and punish anybody who is guilty of heresy. And that means disagreeing with Scripture. Those found guilty were tortured and killed, and countless thousands were by the inquisitors. It's an incredible story. And paralleling this was a similar belief that the teachings of other revered authorities, not Scripture, but people like Aristotle, were also infallible. It was against this backdrop in 1543 that Nicholas Copernicus, he's a Polish German, he published a book that amassed the growing evidence in support of the heliocentric solar system. That is, where the Earth went around the sun. This came to be called the heliocentric model. This was contrary to the church's teachings and Scripture, which held that the sun went around the Earth, the geocentric model. The church had relied on this view, since the second century teachings of a philosopher called Claudius, not a philosopher, he was a Greek, Egyptian named Claudius Ptolemy, Egyptian astronomer, mathematician, and geographer. Now, scholars discovered that Ptolemy's views were themselves based on the writings of earlier scholars, some dating back 3,100 years. So the Scripture, and which were based on Ptolemy, actually goes back to what people came up with in tents 3,100 years ago in the Middle East. So the church drew a line and forbid anyone from even questioning the description of the relative position of the sun and planets based on what long ago forgotten authors had written 3,100 years ago. So as you can easily imagine, these dueling versions of something as profound and consequential as whether the sun goes around the earth or vice versa set off this immense controversy in Europe. It raged all over Europe. It pitted the Catholic Church, relying solely on this written ancient authority, head to head against the emerging discipline of science, which relied on reason and evidence, including evidence that people could see with their own eyes. As you know, just before this juncture, the history of Christianity had split. Just before this juncture in history, Christianity had split into two warring factions, okay? The Catholics on the one hand, representing the traditional church, and the Protestants, the protesters, on the other hand, representing those who had come to believe that the Catholic Church had become corrupt and that its views on Christian doctrine in the Bible had become distorted and false. This schism, as it was called, led to some of the most ferocious and violence and bloodshed the world has ever seen. Between 1618 and 1648 alone, in what is now Germany, Catholic villagers went into a Protestant village and slaughtered every single man, woman, and child. Then a Protestant village did the same to a Catholic village. By 1648, only 30 years later, a staggering 1/2 of the entire population of what is now Germany lay dead. Traditional wars
So
with
let me
armies.
just reconfirm where we're at right now. We're talking about the science of Earth going around the sun, sun going around the Earth, some basic questions along those lines. And then the Catholic Church, it's supposed to be there for this loving God, and dispelling that story somehow gets translated in, oh, let's go kill a lot of people.
Well, that's a very, very interesting point, Randy. And there are writers and scholars, who have said that the Christians who were based on what this guy who's undisputably a pacifist, Christ,
Right.
killed more people than any other religion or doctrine in history by some huge margin. I mean, not counting the world wars, it's hundreds of millions of people. And this slaughter that went on in Germany went on all over Europe. And
well, we only had George Carlin back then, who reduced the 10 Commandments down to 2. And basically,
who did that?
He did. He reduces the 10 Commandments down to 2 commandments. And the 2 commandments are don't make love to your neighbor's wife, and oh, by the way, don't kill anybody. And that's it. He said, if we could just do that, and be nice to people, that's all really needed. I mean, a lot of basic religions, they talk about that. But how many people have been killed for the sake of their religion in this particular era that you're talking about is so overwhelming. The only reason I'm interjecting this is it's so powerful what you're saying is that you're pointing out, let's call it holy terror, for how many centuries did this go on? And one of the things is, do we go around the sun, or did the sun go around us? Let's sit and talk about that all day. I think it would have been a good time for a lot of marijuana and drinking. Get what I'm gonna say? It just,
Well, this is behind this whole slaughter, and has a fascinating backstory to it. That Philip II, who was the king of Spain, had gotten so much money looted from South America, and these two mines down there that produce prodigious amounts of gold and silver, Zapatacas and Potosi, and he had the means for the first time and only time in history, in the late 16th century, to actually invade England and the Protestants and impose Catholic orthodoxy. He long ago they wanted to get rid of science. And so he built this huge thing called the Armada, Spanish Armada, to come and hang Queen Elizabeth. And he would have done it, and they would have prevailed, but for the fact that two hurricanes came up during the time that the Armada was, and blew it first into the English coast, into the French coast, and then it went around and blew into the Irish coast, and they slaughtered them in the beaches. And he was never able to do it. And as a result of that, neither the Protestants nor the Catholics gained hegemony enough to defeat the others. But they each believed deeply that you are obligated, as a Christian, you're obligated to kill anybody who disagrees with you on this. And so it spawned this bloodshed that went on for centuries. And interesting, because neither side could get dominance, eventually they just were lay exhausted, and it gave rise to the doctrine of religious tolerance that emerged in the 17th century for the first time, because there was no choice. They couldn't keep killing each other. And that eventually led to political tolerance. And today, if you look at the difference between what we call the West and the rest of the world, we believe in this tolerance, which no one else believes in the world. They all believe in the old honor culture. If you disagree with me, I have to kill you. Especially if you disagree with my king, I have to kill you. And that's what Russians and the Chinese and the rest of the world are, honor cultures. We in the West, what we call the West, believe in this tolerance concept. And the tolerance concept, ironically, arose out of this mass bloodshed where neither side could gain hegemony. And after a couple of centuries, they just said, okay, we got to figure out some way to live together. And this is how they did it. It was 100% contrary to the belief that they all had, that they had an obligation to kill each other. They had to put that aside and adopt this tolerance, which was new at the time. Completely new. And that was adopted by the colonies in our Constitution. And this notion of freedom of speech and freedom of religion we were the first country in the world to do that. This was radical at the time. Okay. So the Catholic Church rejected all this, and they said that everything was infallible, and that the Protestants supported science. And because the Protestants supported science and the Catholics were against it, it turbocharged this whole conflict. And that's one reason why it went on for centuries. And so against this backdrop, there's this bloody thing. There emerged this fascinating story I think more people should know about. And I'm going to tell you right now about this Italian inventor and artist, a philosopher, mathematician named Galileo Galilei, and his battles with the Catholic Church over this issue of heliocentrism versus geocentrism, and what he wrote about it and what happened to him, framed this issue in a way that's profound and speaks to us to this day. Okay, Galileo, as he was called then, it was this renowned professor and chair of mathematics, ironically also a teacher of Aristotelian philosophy. Now, Aristotle didn't always believe in science, which is kind of interesting. And he was at the University of Pisa, but Galileo strongly believed in Thales philosophy, okay, particular science, that we rely on evidence over blindness, adherence to authority. So what happened to Galileo, in his views, is this hinge point in history, where the history had to choose one or the other. And this is only 400 years ago, and that's 2,000 years after Thales, So this young professor and scientist, Galileo, rejecting blind adherence to Aristotle, okay, many of his peers at the University of Pisa believed in blind adherence to such authority, especially Aristotle, who was revered. And Aristotle had written that an object accelerates under the influence of gravity in proportion to its weight, its mass. meaning if you dropped a heavy thing, it would accelerate faster than a lighter thing, okay? Galileo determined quickly that was not true by evidence. And to prove it, he went to the top of the Tower of Pisa, Leaning Tower of Pisa, which is where his university is located. And in front of a huge mob of people, he dropped a series of objects, a heavy object and a light object, from the top of the tower. And they both landed at the same instant, which proved that Aristotle was wrong. Okay? Not only that, but he went on to show through mathematical models that Aristotle was wrong on a number of other famous positions, including his theories about parabolas and other teachings. So now you would think that Galileo's peers at Pisa University, along with other scholars, indeed the public at large, would praise, honor, and reward somebody who not only discovered this profound error in the teaching of a revered ancient scholar, but he also had the courage and determination to hold on to and continue to promote this discovery of this error in the face of skepticism, wrath, ridicule, and threats, and to demonstrate that truth to the world. But if you think that you would be wrong, right? That Galileo had dared to defy the teachings of Aristotle, even though he was Galileo was proved correct. Anger.
Let me just take a moment of time out, because what we're going to be getting to and guiding this to is you're painting a picture where knowledge and transition of the acceptance of knowledge of what was real and not real, and based upon the time, is somehow going to lead to a meaningful conclusion in the next few minutes as we continue on with the story. Because going back into decipher back in this era, now Galileo, I think you said about 400 years ago.
Yes.
In the scope of time, he fascinating character. Aristotle, another great person in history that I think his assignment was to write something that determined all knowledge of all human being or kind or in the past, whatever, somehow based upon the threat of death. If he didn't do that, he wasn't under threat, but I think that it was a difficult thing to write at the time. Very, very knowledgeable human being. But the reason that Robert, you're going into this is to paint the picture going forward of giving people the opportunity to do some critical thinking, to understand where we're going to head with this, to help people understand that where we are today, it is extremely important to get into critical thinking. So I wanted to underscore all of this layers of decades, centuries of the fight and the difficulty it was to just even determine that we are going around the sun and not, have fear of living the rest of your life in jail, as I'm sure you're going to go into with Galileo, in the church, determining what's going on in space. I mean, it's a fascinating concept to us. We know that the moon, well, I guess most of us agree it goes around us and we go around the sun. But again, the simplest of things that Robert Mills is trying to paint for us is this very essential idea of dealing with real facts and real critical thinking. And I'm sorry to divulge, but you do such a great job of painting that picture. I wanted to make sure that people understood where we're going with it.
Thank you, Ryan. That was all extremely helpful and insightful. And what the Galileo says, as I'm going to finish the story, you'll see, is just how fragile this was.
Yeah.
And how it's only 400 years ago when people did not believe it at all. And it's a brand new thing that science in concept goes back to Thales, but no one believed it or understood it or followed it. And in fact, the church, which is demonstrably powerful, we're dead fast against it. So you see how fragile it was and how, but for a few twists and turns in history, science would have been swept away. And this whole concept would be lost. It's only 400 years ago. So Galileo's great moment, and I call it a hinge point in history, happened at this point. And in the late 1500s, the Dutch had discovered how to ground glass to make telescopes and microscopes. And what they saw in them contradicted the versions of the truth that the church had been pushing, okay? And as we know, the church had declared Copernicus' 1543 book about the sun going around as heresy. You couldn't mention it. You're forbidden to even discuss it. And so Galileo witnesses this heated debate, and being dedicated to letting evidence decide the truth, he decided in typical Galileo fashion to literally see for himself. So in 1609, he taught himself how to ground glass and made himself a series of ever powerful telescopes that he pointed to the skies. And he was astonished there to see moons on the mountains on the moon, moons going around Jupiter, rings of Saturn. But he also observed Mercury and Venus going through phases like our moon does, which they could not do unless they were in orbits around the sun that were closer to the sun than the Earth, which essentially by itself proved the heliocentric model. Now, Galileo believed naively that once people saw, even the church, they saw with their own eyes that two planets were revolving around the sun closer than the sun than the Earth, they would accept the heliocentric explanation because there was no other possible explanation for what you could see with your own eyes. And Galileo wrote 3 books about this. Okay, the first one is in 1610 called The Starry Messenger. And there he outlined what he saw, but he steered clear of overtly addressing the helio versus geodesic, but he hinted at it. And the book didn't have the impact. He thought that people would look at this and say, well, what this means is, but especially the church, but they didn't. The church paid no heed to it. And the Vatican, in fact, warned him, don't steer clear of Copernican teachings. But he's increasingly becoming obsessed with this. So he wrote another book called Ad Saggiatore, and that also had little impact. So at this point, he was become obsessed with this issue. So he went to the Vatican. And he had 6 interviews with the Pope himself because he was a famous guy. And Pope Urban VIII met with him, and Galileo tried to persuade him to be a convert, as it were, to the heliocentric model. But all the Pope would concede was to give him permission to write a book about the theories of the universe, which included the heliocentric model, but warned him to treat Copernicus and the heliocentric thing only hypothetically. So Galileo then, he had permission now, he thought, and he went all in. And he wrote one of the most influential books of all time. He wrote this book called The Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, Ptolemaic and Copernicus, published in 1632. On the cover was Aristotle, Ptolemy, and Copernicus talking to each other. Inside, instead of explicitly saying that the Copernican model was the correct one, in an effort to covertly deny church teachings, Galileo ingeniously framed the issue in his book as an imaginary debate between 2 fictitious philosophers. One of the philosophers was obviously a proxy for Galileo's own views and those of Copernicus. In the fictitious debate, Galileo let that character set forth the clear, powerful, and compelling facts and arguments in support of heliocentrism. And into the mouth of the other fictitious philosopher, who Galileo named the Italian language equivalent of simpleton, he put the church's illogical positions on geocentrism, and into simpleton's mouth, Galileo even put the Pope's own favorite arguments, and even included quotes from the Pope's writings, not just using the facts and evidence, which anyone with a telescope could see. Just using the facts and the evidence, which anyone with a telescope could see with their own eyes. This book made the geocentric model, and likewise the position of the Catholic Church, seem ludicrous and contrary to all logic and evidence, which of course it was. The church's reaction obviously was swift. The Pope convened a commission to examine the book and make recommendations. They found that Galileo had not treated Copernican theory hypothetically, and he was ordered to appear in Rome for the Inquisition. And on the first appearance there, they pointed out to him they'd already warned him once not to discuss Copernican. So they found him guilty of heresy. They forced him to abjure, which is to say, get up and publicly say he was wrong and apologize. And then they sentenced him to life in prison. But because he was so famous, there was a lot of pressure. They softened that to house arrest, with the admonition, however, if he mentioned Copernican theory again, he'd be executed. The Catholic Church went on to issue rulings that went beyond Copernican theory. The Church ruled it would henceforth be heresy to challenge a number of treatises and theories in the laws of physics, including those of Aristotle. In other words, it would be heresy to point out errors or challenge any works, even if they were clearly wrong. This caused a huge controversy, and it raged all over Europe and beyond. But regardless of the work, what the church said or did, the pure genius of Galileo's famous book and the imaginary dialogue was that the powerful, reasoned arguments made by Galileo's proxy characters in the books were there for the whole world to read. And the cited evidence was also there for anyone to see with their own eyes. Galileo's great book played a huge role in advancing science and even accelerating the great schism between the Catholic Church and Protestantism, drawing on the surging perception that science was threatened by the Catholics, which of course it was. The Protestant king, James I, founded the Royal Society of Science in London in 1660. In large part,
Ken, I just want to jump in there, because what really, I know this gets ahead again, but if Galileo wasn't strong enough to write that brilliant book, to stand up to the church, knowing that probably it wasn't going to go well for him, is that we'd still be living in the madness of the church, and their teaching.
It was so close. I mean, were it not for these two hurricanes, which the historians have called jokingly the Protestant wind. If it wasn't for those two hurricanes, Philip II would have hanged Queen Elizabeth. There's only 30,000 soldiers in Queen Elizabeth's army, and they had like 60 or 90,000 troops ready to invade England. They were going to hang her, and they were going to go into the Netherlands and find all those people, hang them, and the Catholic Orthodox would be imposed on the world. The Catholic Protestant schism would be ended in favor of Catholicism, and science would be abolished to this day.
I mean, it's just amazing that the miracle of life is one thing, but the miracle of truth being threaded all the way back to when you said that the first reason, somebody sat down and said, hey, we got to talk about reason and logic in a way, to put the stamp on the world. But now this ribbon of the ability to talk about truth is like a ribbon of gold that you find in a mountain. It's a miracle. It's somehow worked way fragilely. And I know we're going to get to a future part of this broadcast, but it's just how fragile truth is.
That's a very, very, it was so fragile. Had it not been for Galileo, had he been hanged or something, I mean, had it not been for him and getting this book published, which went all over Europe, and if people could read it, they could see what it tells you with their own eye. It turbocharged the whole thing. And then that led these English kings, because they were not killed by the Spanish Armada. It led James I to found the Royal Society of Science in 1660. And Louis XIV, not to be outdone, the French king, he likewise a Protestant, founded the French Royal Academy in 1666. And so at this critical moment, science was this nascent little tiny thing. And these two powerful, prestigious kings and these two powerful, influential gave science this huge and flourishing boost in prestige and support. Had they not done that, who knows what would have happened? Okay. This enabled Isaac Newton to write his Principles of Natural Philosophy in 1687, which is arguably the greatest treatise in physics ever written. And it violated some of the Aristotelian precepts. He was able to do that in England because of what, the scientific principles that were protected by the king, which all came from Galileo. And all this led to an explosion of discoveries that transformed the world, and virtually everything we think of as the modern world, from medicine, drugs, transportation, communication, commerce, every aspect of modern life arose from this little fragile thing we've been talking about. And science being based solely on reason and physical evidence to explain the material world. Okay. And so as we take this now forward 4 centuries of enormous progress, take me back to that moment in Budapest. How did something like the Holocaust ever happen in modern, sophisticated Europe? And the answer is shockingly and sadly simple, and it goes back to the precept of this podcast, that Thales' basic 2,500-year-old insight to rely on evidence and reason was ignored, and it continues to be ignored by many today. Germany didn't have universal high school in the mid 20th century like we did. And despite having these great universities and highly advanced technology, there was a huge ignorant middle class, and that's who Hitler recruited. And those Germans who wanted to participate in this vast slaughter, they didn't ask for evidence of these innocent people did anything. And they just unquestionably accepted Hitler's and the Nazi sympathizers' preposterous claims about the Jews. Sadly, this same exact phenomenon is increasingly present now in the US.
Now,
Our
let's
elementary
just
high-
stop. I want to stop you right there. Is what you just said is extremely powerful. It is the linkage from the preamble to bringing you into this next area of topic. Is that the Germans were, because of those who are ignorant and not and uneducated, were listening to this story, and everything that happened back then, they believed what Hitler had to say. And now thread it forward, Robert, tie it together. What's
Well,
going on now?
it's doing just what you just suggested. The same exact phenomena that happened with the Nazis is increasingly present right now. Our elementary and high schools, as we've discussed, have been declining in quality, and the education people get have been declining in quality for decades. And the Trump Musk MAGA phenomena is this horrifying parallel with the Nazis and Hitler, and that they all promote numerous profound untruths for which there's not only no evidence, but massive irrefutable evidence rebuts what they say. Nevertheless, those falsehoods are believed by millions of Trump, Elon, MAGA supporters because they've never been taught the fundamental premise of the modern world, the insight of Thales and the Greek philosophers, and of science itself, that they should think critically and demand evidence before believing a disputed claim, especially one as vicious and preposterous is the notion that Jews were behind all sorts of monstrous evil in the world and had to be exterminated. Science, the scientific revolution's most fundamental and simple tenet that one should rely upon factual evidence before believing far-fetched claims is becoming increasingly less accepted or even understood in the United States. This is especially true of the Trump MAGA followers, and the almost identical parallels with the early Nazi examples is strikingly and deeply disturbing. The Nazis never offered a shred of evidence that the Jews were behind any of the things, all the evil on earth. They drank the blood of children. They're out to get. They never bothered. Millions believed it anyway. And it's a fascinating exercise to quickly examine now what we're going to do. 3 false, incredibly important MAGA claims that are about extremely consequential matters that are clearly false but believed by tens of millions of Americans. All of these claims precisely fit this absolutely no evidence description. They're all easily rebutted and debunked.